In this session, we're going to hear from Dr. Claire Hemingway, who is a program officer in the Office of International Science and Engineering at NSF. And her talk will be entitled, What is the Network-to-Network Approach? She is leading the new NSF-wide program to foster the creation of international networks of networks called AccelNet. Before joining NSF, she led a collaborative initiative across more than 18 international scientific organizations to enhance engagement in the scientific enterprise and scientific literacy by harnessing digital learning technologies to provide innovative online mentoring for student research teams. She recently served as an Embassy Science Fellow at the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa, Canada. So thank you, Claire.
So my thanks to Carrie and Margaret and John and the whole team here at SESYNC. We're delighted that you're hosting this. And what I will do here in my brief presentation is to do a rather high-level description of how NSF has come to this network of network approaches. I know some people may be interested in the details of the solicitation, but I'll handle questions like that in a different venue. And we will, of course, be offering webinars for the research community to get into those sort of nitty-gritty details. But I want to give you a sense of how we have come to develop an international network-to-network collaboration program. So I'll start with a bit of context about NSF. And as many of you know, being funded by NSF or involved in NSF funded projects, that NSF has funded research collaborations across various scales, small to large, research collaborations that have an institutional hub and those that are widely distributed and have no home base. The collaborations are very diverse that NSF has funded. And so I provide here some examples of collaborative research programs, such as one from the Office of International Science and Engineering, PIRE, Partnerships in International Research and Education. There are other focused collaborative efforts, such as the Dimensions of Biodiversity program that have run. At larger scales, there are the centers, like the synthesis centers, the engineering research centers, the science and technology centers, all of which have a specific purpose in bringing people together to collaborate. I'm going to focus more on the research networks and how they have fed into the network of network approach. What I do want to highlight is at all of these levels of research collaboration that NSF has funded, there are some that have explicitly called for international activities to be a part of it, and many others that have welcomed international collaboration, but that's not been an explicit purpose of the opportunity. So I also want to highlight that no matter what the scale, small or large, or no matter the focus being centered in a hub or having a distributed focus, as the research collaborations expand in scope and scale, there's some common features to the research calls. And so I pulled a Wordle, pulling terms from the calls for proposals from the larger scale collaborative programs. And you'll see that they're all calling for many similar features. And that's that coordination and management are called out as items that proposers must pay attention to and provide plans for. That the strategic research theme and the vision and the goals have to be clearly defined in these large-scale research collaborations, and that the participants are the focus of many of the activities, and the evaluation of how those activities will play out is critical. So I highlight the fact that no matter which of these collaborative programs is called for, there are some common features because collaborating at scale requires some fundamental activities. Many of you mentioned in your introduction that you've been involved in research coordination networks, and NSF has made a substantial investment in supporting the Research Coordination Network program. Its purpose has been to catalyze new networks. It supports networks in all areas that NSF funds, and there are often calls for research coordination networks that are associated with specific special programs at NSF. And I list a couple here. The Infuse, Innovations at the Nexus of Food, Water, and Energy, has funded research coordination networks. The Coupled Natural and Human Systems program has funded research coordination networks. There was a long-standing effort called SEAS that funded quite a number of research coordination networks. And if you went to the NSF website and used the search feature to look for projects that had been funded, and you used the advanced search function, typing in research coordination networks, you would come up with quite a large sample size, over 3,000. So what I want to highlight is that NSF has been investing in catalyzing specific networks for a long period of time, and that there have been a number of networks funded under sort of large research themes. And that provides quite a body of researchers out there who may have been working in independent networks that could do new things if they created synergies by linking their networks. NSF has also funded a number of explicitly international networks, and I highlight one here that just got off the ground this year. It is an international network collaboration explicitly focused in the neurosciences, and it's a collaborative effort with NSF and counterpart funding agencies in the UK, in Germany, and in Canada. And this call explicitly looks for collaborative networks that involve researchers in at least two of those countries, and brings together researchers of about 15 to 20 partners across those two or more countries that are going to explicitly look at experimentation, analysis, and new discoveries in neuroscience. And I'm highlighting a piece from their solicitation that the emphasis here on scales much larger than could be done otherwise. And that really is much of what a network is all about. Collaborating in order to work at a scale that is not possible within a smaller research team that maybe you are all going to publish together. The networks are more loosely affiliated on larger research themes. So scale matters. That's where I want to turn to the fact that the investments that NSF has made in fostering our own domestic research networks and facilitating these international collaborative networks means that there is a wide array of networks that can have the possibility to be scaled to networks of networks. And it's a different level of engagement than NSF has funded before. So as Margaret mentioned, the center is an experiment. Well, this international network-to-network collaboration is also somewhat of an experiment. We're starting this year. We'll see where we go. We hope to adapt over time. And part of the way we adapt is by bringing the community together to learn what questions, concerns you have, what we are not providing that you need. And this effort to scale from catalyzing a single network that's focused in one area to supporting networks of networks that are linked to create new synergies across different networks is something that we are pretty confident that there is a need for, but we are not sure that we understand all the needs of the community yet. So I'll thank you in advance for going along this journey with us together. So what I want to do is tell you a little bit about the AccelNet program. I'm going to jump back and forth between some specifics about AccelNet and then background that informed how we developed this program. So it is explicitly scaling from catalyzing a single network to supporting networks of networks. And explicitly what we mean by that is we want to support strategic linkages among U.S. research networks and complementary networks abroad that are tackling grand scientific challenges that require a coordinated effort in an international domain. So I'm going to step back now to talk about a bit of terminology. We've already mentioned in a couple of our conversations about language matters, the terms that we use matter. We might not all be using language in the same way, so being explicit about what we mean is often helpful. Interestingly enough, the terms network are used a lot, but rarely actually clearly defined. And so what I've done here is pull a study from 2017 that was looking at the research enterprise in Norway. And in this article, they define a research group as a collaboration that is institutionally based. And they define a network as a collaboration that crosses institutional boundaries. They also comment, of course, that things can be blurred and that there are realities of research collaborations occurring simultaneously at multiple scales. So what do I mean by that? I'll actually give you a little bit of the data. The study here surveyed researchers at universities in Norway and asked them, how do you collaborate to a large degree? Do you work alone? Do you work in an informal research group? Do you work in a formal research group? Are you part of an international network? Or no, are you both a part of a research group and part of an international network? And you can see the scientific domains in which they asked people to identify themselves were social science, natural science, technology, and medicine. And this may come as no surprise to you, but there are differences in disciplines in whether or not people typically work alone, like the social sciences working on their book that will be their best work ever and takes them a decade to prepare, or folks in medicine who typically work in a formal research group, part of their own school of medicine or institute. And the natural sciences, as you see, they work across all different kinds of collaborative efforts, but they're the ones who are often involved in those international networks and a combination of research groups and international networks. The point here is that most researchers are working in multiple ways as they collaborate and simultaneously, and the configurations in which they are collaborating are fulfilling different needs for their collaborative work, for their own research endeavors, and their complementary strategies to work in a smaller research group and a larger research network, international or not. So I'll turn back now to the AccelNet program, and in the solicitation, we explicitly define a network and a network of networks. And I'll highlight that our definitions draw on the distribution of researchers. Are they institutionally based or dispersed across institutions? What is the function of that collaboration? And then what's the scope of the contribution of that research collaboration? So we define in the solicitation a network as an established, coordinated, and distributed group of scientific researchers who cooperate within or across fields to collect and share resources, knowledge, and expertise. So we have already tagged the fact that a network in our sense means that we do not expect researchers to all be at the same institution, same department, same institute, but to be brought together in sharing knowledge and data because of their common interest in their research problem. And they may be found distributed anywhere. And then we define a network of networks as a formal link amongst networks that's going to serve as a force multiplier or an amplifier with the explicit purpose of advancing the frontiers of science. That is, tackling a problem at such a large scale that it requires the synergies, the complementarity, the sharing of expertise and knowledge across more than one network. Because it as was mentioned earlier, diversity matters, and so those perspectives that each network has should, in a combinational effect, yield something that would allow a larger research problem to be advanced. So don't think at the scale of a narrow research topic that could be answered by a research team, but a major need in a disciplinary or interdisciplinary field that would propel that field forward. So the scope of the research contribution matters in the network of networks. Frankly, you wouldn't need to pull together researchers from so many places to tackle a small problem. It wouldn't be needed. So I'm going to hone in on this a little bit because we found as we were planning the AccelNet program and unrolling the program that it was often difficult for people to distinguish what we meant by a network of networks and blurring what is a network versus what is a linkage across different networks. And so we explicitly try to drive home that we do not see a network of networks at something at a scale of 1 to 2 formal research groups here in the U.S. connecting to 1 to 2 formal research groups abroad. And that how those entities may be brought together in a research project that would be funded would have to have the activities and the benefits extending beyond the PI, co-PI, senior personnel, and those institutions that the individuals are connected to. That it really, to serve a network of networks, needs to actively involve and benefit the participants of the network. And then we also want to make somewhat of a distinction between the research networks that might be linked and stakeholders, that word was brought up earlier, the stakeholders that might play an important role in being a part of the research network effort to tackle a grand scientific challenge, but they may not be individuals who are actually doing the research. Or they may not be a network. So certainly folks working at a national lab may be doing research, but they are not necessarily a network if they are part of a national lab. They are already part of an established formal research group. And so we also want people to think carefully about what is a research group versus what is a stakeholder that may have a very important role in a network of networks, but is not functioning in the same way as a network of researchers who will devise the methodology and collect the data per se. So some of things that would fit our view as an AccelNet network of networks is a configuration in which key roles were held by members of multiple networks, and that those benefits truly do reach out to all of the networks, and that there is open membership. So that, again, sort of to contrast it with a formal research group where your position in a formal research group may very well be because you belong to a department. And someone cannot simply join because they have a common interest. They actually have to be part of that institution. In our network of networks view, we see that what is connecting people is their shared research effort, and that being able to join because they have something to contribute to that research effort is what is important. We also view that that network of networks should have the capacity to evolve over time. Again, part of that is the open nature, that new participants could come in. Part of the evolution over time is that networks, as they make discoveries and understand really what their aligned missions can achieve, that they will need to adapt over time. So thinking of the network of networks as a living, growing, morphing entity is much more of what we have in mind than fixed entities that may have more rigid boundaries and have benefits all moving internally. So what I'll do next is to give you a little sense of some of the input we received to get to developing a call. We did, as I sort of alluded to by describing some of the scales at which NSF supports collaborations, look internally to see whether or not there was anything at NSF that was funding network of network scale. And really there's not in a grand way. So we felt confident that we are filling a need, at least from the NSF perspective. To cross-check that view with the research communities, we put out a Dear Colleague letter, and we asked for researchers to tell us, do they see that there is a need for a network of network opportunities in their research field, and if so, what sort of considerations should we be taking in as we were planning a program. And the responses of those Dear Colleague letters that were put out in 2017 indicated that across all fields that NSF funds, people see the opportunity for their research domain. And then we brought together a number of outside experts to guide us more closely in some efforts. And these did include folks who have expertise in team science, folks who have expertise in the international science domain, and obviously we drew on the literature as well. So I'm going to turn to a couple pieces in the literature that I think are valuable. And one is a study by Caroline Wagner, who was on our subcommittee and is a member of the advisory committee for NSF on science and engineering. And she and her colleague put out a really exciting study looking at the impact of science. And as you very well know, we often measure impact by whether or not a publication is highly cited, and so that is what was used here, versus the openness of the research environment. And so countries that have more scientists, more mobile, going in and out of their countries on shorter or longer research exchanges, produce papers that are more highly cited. So I've sort of don't have all of the countries represented here. I scaled it back to make it easier for you to see where the U.S. stands here. Point is, researcher mobility really matters. It matters at the individual researcher scale. It matters for the research collaboration. It actually matters for our national scientific enterprise. So I'll come back now to the survey that was done for Norwegian researchers, because I want to highlight the other thing that I think is really important, and that's that the mobility really matters for early career researchers. The same researchers who were surveyed to say what kinds of collaborations they worked in, also were broken down by their academic rank. And so here you see that full professors in Norway are more likely to be involved in research groups and international networks, whereas assistant professors in Norway are more likely to be working alone or in formal groups, but less likely to be part of an international network. I don't think Norway will be an outlier. I think we could probably survey many countries and see this pattern. Point that I want to drive home is that mobility and the opportunity to be part of a large-scale collaboration is of great benefit to early career researchers. So those two pieces come together in the AccelNet program, which I've already mentioned what it seeks to support by bringing U.S. and complementary research networks together to tackle grand scientific challenges. What we explicitly hope to have happen is that these linkages across networks will accelerate the progress of scientific discovery in that specific scientific grand challenge area, and that they will prepare U.S. postdocs, students, and early career researchers for conducting and leading these large-scale international collaborative efforts. So we outline in the solicitation explicit characteristics that we think those networks of networks should achieve, and obviously international engagement has to be integral to the success, cannot be an add-on, and that there must be alignment of the missions and goals across those networks, and they should be leveraging the resources of those various networks for mutual benefit. Because we're keen on seeing preparation of the next generation, there should be explicit professional skill development and a global research perspective included. And here's a last point that we want those networks of networks to have, that they should be developing protocols, activities, and products that are going to reduce the barrier to international collaboration. There are huge barriers to international collaboration beyond our cultural differences, and so we want the networks of networks that form to help solve some of those problems, not only for their own network of networks, but things that could be shared more broadly. So we offer opportunities both at a catalytic level and a larger scale. I'm not going to go into any detail there. I just want to highlight that. And that we want those efforts to have a vision and goal that obviously is going to drive the field forward. And we do make some specifications that it should be either a community-identified grand challenge, that there is consensus in the research area, that this is a large scientific problem that will require entities to come together to solve. Or an NSF big idea, and I won't go into that. It's available on the website. We can talk about it later. The point is we're sort of channeling proposers how to think about that scientific grand challenge. The other components I won't dive into because really much of the sessions later today pick up on pieces of these. What I want to highlight is that we do have clear expectations for how the projects can craft their network of networks to address some of those coordination and management issues, the role of the leadership, the role of the participants, and the activities that will allow those to function. The other thing I want to say, and it's another reason this workshop exists, is that any project at a network of network scale is going to have to require some intentional approaches and forethought to be successful. And again, I highlight the coordination management issue because there's no doubt that that one working at a network of network scale will require significant effort. I also highlight here that professional skill development for students, postdocs, and early career researchers is an area that will require significant intentional thought. You can't just throw a few students in an international collaboration and expect by osmosis they will later be able to lead one. So I highlight that component as well. Obviously, there are other areas that require intentionality, but for simplicity, I'm highlighting two that I think that will either make or break projects. And then the last thing I want to do is let you know what's happening with the AccelNet program. I said in 2017 we put out an initial call to the research community to tell us whether or not a program was needed. We have run the first competition and we are making the first awards now. Some are still yet to come out, but I have listed on the slide here those that are publicly available. We have funded projects both at the catalytic level and the full implementation scale. And I think, as was mentioned earlier today, we will be planning the first project meeting in October. We, again, rather intentionally chose to do that very early on in the award cycle so that we could bring these network of network leadership teams together to talk about common challenges they may see, their plans, so that they can share ideas and begin to build community. It will take a community of practice to collect the information about how networks of networks function, so that we can then later share lessons learned at that scale. So I'll stop there and step away from the podium and turn it over to Carrie for some questions.
Thank you for that presentation. That was great. I'm curious, is the idea of the network of networks to actually fund science, or is it more about funding networking?
Yep. So thank you for that question. It's a key one. As the AccelNet program is really taking the research coordination network model and scaling it to networks of networks. We have taken with us the approach that we will not fund the science per se, we are funding the networking. We do have in the solicitation the option for projects to include research funds if they are targeting the students, postdocs, or early career researchers, and up to a certain percentage of the total budget. So we acknowledge that it's very hard to separate the research and the networking, but we target the research funds for those that we think will benefit most.
Question here on cyber infrastructure. I think that Ariane had mentioned this earlier, and I think there is a lot of progress to be made in that area to develop cyber infrastructure tools to enhance the capacity of network for a network of networks. And so is there thinking about perhaps partnering with cyber infrastructure folks at NSF to create a larger pool of funds that can be drawn on to actually build those tools that actually increase capacity?
I'm getting my notebook out now to write down these good questions. The answer is we have not done that, and we do explicitly say in the program solicitation that it is not a program to build cyber infrastructure. We do anticipate that not only will there already be some established networks that can be linked, but those networks are drawing on cyber infrastructure that has been developed as those networks have been developed. But there is no doubt that there are additional cyber infrastructure needs, but we haven't partnered with the SESYNC directorate to create an opportunity that would specifically address that.
Thank you. I have a couple of linked questions as I'm trying to wrap my head around the vision here. So coming back to the first question, if the bulk of the funding should be allocated not towards research activities, but towards more supporting the construction and maintenance of networks, then does the types of things that are likely to be competitive for funding are those things like workshops, meetings, like what types of, so my first question is what types of activities is ExcelNet most excited about seeing happen? And then related to that, a network of networks involves lots and lots and lots of entities, and the dollars don't trickle that far into the multiple layers of that. So I'm wondering like what ExcelNet is thinking about, how dollars can support things versus how leverage and goodwill and other relationships can continue to support good work happening. And then more from a bit of a nuts and bolts question, how senior do PIs have to be for a proposal to be competitive? I'm sorry, that's super nuts and boltsy. But then also I'm noticing up here that the ones successful last year are entirely universities. What is the role for boundary organizations?
So let me say, because most of these are collaborative proposals, we are including in this list the lead PI. If we included all of the entities, there was no way I could fit it on a slide. So do take that into consideration, that what you see is not the extent of the collaborative effort. There's no way it could be. But it is true that it is typical at NSF that the lead PI and lead institution is often an academic. The solicitation does not require that. So to be competitive, it would be need to simply be meritorious. There's no restriction. Let me see where I tackle. I think what I'll tackle first is the kinds of activities. And, you raise a really important question about the kinds of activities that we want to see. There are a bazillion workshops out there. So simply putting a proposal that adds another, several dozen workshops, that might be a known model, but it might not actually meet the needs of the network of networks. And so we encourage teams to think about what the network of network needs. We don't specify, because networks that come together are going to be at different stages of maturity. They're going to have different needs. And so the configuration of activities should meet the needs of that network of networks. But we do encourage, as NSF always does, innovative ideas, but also evidence-based ideas. So you want to choose activities that have a good rationale, but we don't specify. And the question about the funding, whether it's in-kind, collaboration, support, again, we do anticipate that these international networks of networks will have, in addition to the NSF funding, some goodwill that allows the effort to be carried out beyond our borders. There are some funds allocated for travel for international partners and scholar exchange and other sorts of critical activities for mobility and knowledge exchange to advance the frontiers. But as is typical at NSF, we do not explicitly fund research in international environments. And so in that case, we do the standard, we hope that the international researchers, if they are funding their research activities, have funding within their own countries.
I have a question regarding catalytic versus full scale. I know you covered this a little bit, but could you elaborate on that a little? I mean, is this primarily related to scale of funding, or is there scale of activities, or is there, are you expecting something different from a catalytic than you are a full?
Yeah, great question, thank you. So really, their rationale for setting these two levels was based not only the responses that we got from the community, from the Dear Colleague level letters, but also from the advice we got from our expert body. that noted that there will be great needs at different levels. And so it makes sense to offer opportunities that are going to target the kinds of needs for less mature and more mature networks of networks. So catalytic level really should be at the earlier stages of figuring out, once a scientific grand challenge is identified, how would the networks begin to align? What expertise would need to be brought together? How would the networks actually create the synergies? What are their contributions? So they're at much more of that planning level. We know we have something promising, but we don't have much in place. And so it's much more about those preliminary conversations about how would we align, what would we align, where can we advance the field. Whereas full-level projects should be at the stage that they've already got a sense of the landscape of the research problem and have already identified what knowledge gaps their new synergies could fill. So they've done that lay of the land work and are ready to say, here's where we see we can clearly advance the field. So they've got a much more concrete path forward.
I think that's a good segue into a question that I had based on something that you mentioned that I found striking. You did mention that the scope of research contribution matters. And the question that I have is, if a big challenge, community-identified challenge, must be addressed, is there some conflict in between how broad that challenge would be and the specific research questions that the network would have to focus on? I think that a potential criticism on the part of reviewers may be that, yeah, the challenge may be big and community identified, but too broad.
Yeah, that's always a problem in research proposals, is the scope of the problem and the plan to address it. I would say that thinking about a network of network scales in which there should be a broad area of research that various research teams that are parts of networks can identify a wide array of kind of projects that would fill that knowledge gap. My personal opinion is that lay of the land should be clear. The kinds of problems that the teams could address should be clear. But if individual specific research projects are outlined at such a detailed level that somewhere there's a gap of scale, and by that I mean, if each experiment is already outlined, you're probably tackling not a grand challenge, but an immediate challenge. And so I think that there needs to be a balance between identifying the broad problem, the approaches that would be taken, the kinds of methodologies that could be used to tackle it, and not researcher A will do experiment 1, researcher B will do experiment 2, because at a broad scale, you should be thinking big science, not small experiment. Those will, of course, happen, but they're not the scale that's needed for a network of networks proposal. Those would be the individual research projects.
Naturally, to achieve the vision that you just described in your last 2 sentences, there's a huge amount of facilitation that is required to come anywhere close to that, especially on an international scale. So I have two questions. What is the role of some sort of coordination, collaboration plan for those who would try to access this mechanism? And within the appropriations, are there dollars that can be dedicated to some sort of facilitation science that could help, drive, build, enhance, augment the, the collaborative strands that are already in place between these networks?
Okay, those are great questions. So I'll tackle first the role of the coordination collaboration. The solicitation does require that a collaboration plan is outlined, and that should describe roles and responsibilities of the leadership. It should describe how the organizational structure will be set up. And how communications might be handled, and who will have the task of doing a lot of that coordination. If there's a lot of scholar exchange and mobility, someone's booking a lot of travel. So back to the personnel question, that should be handled. And so it's absolutely fundamental that there are, within the structure of the project and in the funded portion of that, adequate attention and dollars to handle the coordination efforts. And collaboration, I think it's been brought up as well. How will data be shared? How will IP be shared? There are many issues beyond just the booking of travel that needs to be handled in the coordination effort. And so, yes, that has to be an integral part. And then your question about the facilitation, I think, is a great one. I had a little side conversation during the break about how the program and how projects could be thinking about the contribution to understanding of team science at the network of network scale. And really that is going to mean we need to be crossing our disciplinary borders in order to ensure that we are collaborating with the right entities so that the projects have that support and the program is in aggregate building that body of knowledge to contribute. So thank you.
So within the dimensions of biodiversity and the PIRE, there are identified partner nations
Yes.
for funding.
Yes.
Has that been established with this?
So, great question. Last week, we had a workshop on international partnerships because we knew at the outset that this question of how will international partners be funded. Now, granted, we provide some travel funds, but of course it can't cover absolutely everything. So we knew that there was a need that should be fulfilled. We also knew we couldn't wait until we solved that problem, that we needed to get the program out on the streets and learn what we could and then tackle that problem as we were at sort of the next iteration. I don't know how or when we'll really address the international partnership component, but we are tackling it.
So just as a follow-up question to the international collaborations part, when we talk about grand challenges and things that we can't solve, we're often talking about, we're moving into that space of engaging scientists in the developing world. And I saw a few slides back, that these two parts was the network collaboration and then the learning dimension and the prioritization of skill development and at that early career level. And I just wonder to what it's so fantastic to get our researchers out in the world. What type of, I guess, how does AccelNet also see having that learning alongside collaboration of international scholars in the coming to the United States? Is that also prioritized? Because we can't kind of bring those other networks up to the level without that type of training. And you're going to continue to see Norway and the U.S. in the most highly cited area, and you're not going to see those papers coming from sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm just wondering, how does AccelNet sort of see that dimension? And
Yeah.
I realize it's challenging with international collaborations.
Yeah,
but-
it is. It is challenging, but the funds that the networks of networks can include for travel include U.S. students, researchers, postdocs, whomever, traveling abroad, and other students, postdocs, early career, full professor coming to the U.S. So the exchange can go any direction, and that learning together in community is critical, no matter what direction it's happening. The point is that people should be immersed in activities together, and ideally in more than one venue. So I'll just comment briefly that what often comes up is a question as well about capacity building. And we are very committed to ensuring that we're preparing the next generation of U.S. researchers to tackle these large international collaborative efforts. We hope always that, rising tide lifts all boats, that we are building capacity not only for our own researchers, but others. But as you would expect, this is not a development project, and so we aren't explicitly doing capacity building outside the U.S. And I know you expect that as an answer, but
In the case of a proposal submission where we are creating this international network of networks, how would we indicate within the submission, for example, if I've got a international network or somewhere, we'll say Chile, for example, and they are saying, look, if this gets funded, we will put forward this amount of money, or this agency will provide funds for us to do network of networks activities in this region, in this other country. How do we indicate that then in the proposal submission? Is that something we're permitted to indicate? Because I know in some cases that's not.
we do encourage in the solicitation that within the body of the project description, that the international collaborations and the contributions and the synergies and the resources that will be leveraged are all outlined. We also encourage within the facilities and resources section that the international partners' contributions and resources are outlined there. And so you can indeed use that section.
Okay.
So the section on evaluation says that's a good idea. Any more thoughts on what evaluation would look like?
So we ask that each project include an evaluation plan. We do not require that it is an external evaluation. It can be done internally by the network of networks. As a program, we have sat down with the NSF evaluation team to look at a program-wide evaluation. So like the knowledge development about networks of networks, we're also thinking about looking at that component from a programmatic level, not just a project level. But we do require that there are metrics of some sort, yes, and I'll take the pushback from projects that say we have to develop them as the project goes, but that's an approach. There must be a clear approach and a rationale for that.
If a team considering submitting a proposal were to have, say, another fairly large NSF funding effort in the form of a center or a traineeship, what have you, that is focused on that large challenge, community-identified challenge, would that be seen as a plus or as detrimental to AccelNet from NSF's standpoint? And what I mean is, would NSF say these guys are just trying to double dip? Or, oh no, that's a very good synergy. They're trying to bring together this effort that is already funded and projected abroad, how would that be perceived, do you think?
That's a good question. I'm going to answer it in two ways. I'm first going to start from the approach that by presenting you how NSF has funded collaborations and explicitly, how NSF has invested in building networks, I'm hinting we want people to leverage past investments, that there is no reason that a group should not mention we are building on past NSF funds and leveraging efforts. So that's an important component. Now, whether or not there's a current project that's funded that could have an appropriate complementary activity is a little bit different. You still would be leveraging funding, but we always require that any funded effort is distinct. So you would have to be very clear how an ExcelNet project would do something above and beyond. Certainly it could leverage another effort, but it, of course, can't be duplicative. So you begin to do that fine line, and people do want to see that there is added value, that those extra funds would create something, do something beyond what has been done previously or is currently being done elsewhere. So being as explicit as you can with that is the key.
I wanted to ask, in addition to tackling a major scientific challenge, right? And in some developing countries, the value of publishing a paper, even getting IP, or is relative because there is not much they can get out of it, But then if you have a specific, tangible, actionable results, it's totally different because you get also even recognition from the community because you are showing actual results, right? So how important would it be in the proposal to also have some specific results that can be applicable in real implementations, basically, right? How do you measure the success in terms of publications and patents or IP, the typical scientific output versus real solutions, real implementations, real results? So.
That's a really great question because we want these large-scale efforts to drive the frontiers. Now, obviously, that has explicit in that language, it's about knowledge discovery. However, you can drive the frontier also by what's produced. And so I think that one is having an application and a results-oriented output is going to be valued without any doubt. But that would only be possible if you're driving the frontiers forward, too.
Thank you very much, Claire.